students have to be invested in the topic and what you're reading about. Otherwise, if you don't have them engaged, there's no way. It doesn't matter what the topic is, what the assignment is. They're generally non-readers. There are some exceptions, vulnerable readers. One thing that really works for me in terms of developing a critical eye is working with reading response journals. I have had tremendous success with response journals. I'll give an example just from this semester. We're looking at we're reading the book I Am Malala, which is, I think, the #1 book at this point in the country, and it's written by a woman, a Pakistani woman who's fighting for education for girls in Pakistan. She was shot by a Taliban member. And most of my students knew who she was, so that was a good moment. But when I introduced the idea of keeping a journal, initially it just wasn't working. Initially, I said, all right, well, why don't you read a chapter and summarize, and then just give your reaction, your personal reaction to what's going on. The themes are very powerful themes. And at the beginning, they were very hesitant. And then, you know what happened? I'll tell you what happened. We had a few students who got really engaged with the story, and then I modeled these journals. I just put it right up so everyone could read it. And we read. I had the student read. That's a very powerful thing. I had a student who wrote a really good journal response read their entry out loud. And slowly but surely, most of the students, nearly all of them, got into the reading response journal groove. And suddenly, I'm seeing the kinds of writing that I rarely see from these are reading students, but they're also in writing courses as well. And I think integrating reading and writing is certainly the way to go. Anyway, the kind of writing I'm getting is evidence of a deep connection, that the students are making deep connections with the themes in the book, are very much connected to Malala. And one thing I was really surprised about is I thought that, because it's really important that students feel empowered and that they feel they can place themselves in the narrative, I was concerned that it would be mostly the female students, because it's really a story about educating girls. But what I found, quite shocking indeed, was that the male students were really getting into it and making other kinds of connections about access to education and how they felt like they got cheated in high school and no one paid attention to them and they didn't have a Malala to save them. And they made these connections, and I'm getting 3-page journal entries from students now. It's just incredible.
You said everything so beautifully, eloquently. Well, I do want to add to that, what he has already mentioned. Patrick Winston, who is chair of the Department of Artificial Intelligence at MIT, says that to his students, he says, your careers will be determined by how well you speak, how well you write, and the quality of your ideas. So think about it. Speaking and writing, their output, they're interconnected. And how do you improve your quality of ideas? You obviously have to read, and you have to read with a critical eye. So when we read, we look at the conclusions that are drawn by the author. And I'll give you one example. I was teaching a group of international students, and there was a very provocative article. The title of the article was, In Japan, You Don't Need Love. Married couples are fine without it. So first, when they read that the first time they're reading it, like, oh, great, wow, oh, you don't need love in Japan. And I said, you know what? Let's look at this article first. Who wrote it? Of course, it was an American who had written that article. I'm like, how much do you think this person knows about Japanese culture? Do you think that this person has a profound knowledge of Japanese culture? It did not occur to them. It was written by a North American author. And I said, just the fact that Japanese couples do not say I love you, they don't say I love you. In the English-speaking world, it's almost, required. Otherwise, how would you express your feelings and let the person know how important they are? But I think what it did to these students is when they started reading it very carefully, and he says, and look at the title and how misleading it is. It says, in Japan, you don't need love. I would have rewritten that article that in Japan, you don't say I love you. And that would have been probably more accurate, right? So I think these are the things that our students who are weak readers don't really pick up on. So I introduced the Talmudic approach to reading. or rather studying in general. Talmud is a Hebrew word, and in Hebrew it means to study with a critical eye, to study and think critically. And the Talmudic approach stipulates that we do not accept things at their face value, and that we as readers always question the basic premise, okay, of claims, statements, whatever it is that the authors are making. And when students understand that approach, and it's no wonder that my Israeli students, for example, I've had many Israeli students, they're very questioning. They don't just sit there and say, oh, because so-and-so said it, great. That's the ultimate word. That's the ultimate truth. No. So you have to teach this skill. And why is it important? It is important because in the real world, these students will have a livelihood. Wherever they work, they will be bombarded with information. And it will come in all multiple modalities. Could be an official memo or a report or your annual report or a newspaper that they're reading. If they don't have that ability, they will be vulnerable, of course. So I think that's why it's even more important, that you not just teach them reading, but also teach them critical thinking.